My name is Don Schaefer, and today on the phone we have Jason Moore. He's an environmental historian and a historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he's associate professor of sociology. He's a prolific author, editor, and thinker. His books and essays on environmental history, capitalism, and social theory have been widely recognized. Two of his most well-known books are Capitalism and the Web of Life, Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital, and A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, which Naomi Klein had some interesting comments and says it is an impressive read. She's certainly a big fan. Jason, it's nice to have you on the phone.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Don.
I have to admit, I was reading an article over the weekend about you, and thank God there is a thing called Google, because you had me stumped with some of the words and some of the principles. So I was delighted that you offered to join us. You've got a great perspective on the world, and I want to ask you a dozen questions. I guess to start with, how does environmental history, capitalism, and social theory all come to play in our current social dynamic?
This is a fantastic question, and today we have a very strong and palpable sense of urgency around planetary crisis, shifts in the world's climate systems, in the state of the oceans, in biodiversity around the world, which is being wiped out in what some people call a 6th great extinction of life on this planet. So we have an incontrovertible empirical record of what is going on right now, and we're seeing it unfold right before our eyes. Now, at the same time, we also have problems of profound inequality in income, in wealth, around race and gender, and many other questions. We have questions of joblessness. So the big question to confront is really, how are these connected? And how do we understand the present moment? Because if we don't understand history, then we think everything is just brand new, and we come up with any number of ways, some often fanciful, like let's fix the markets. And we come up with these solutions that aren't really grounded in what created the problems in the first place. And so a lot of what I do is ask, well, how is the usual story that we tell of the world and the problems that have been created? This usual story is about technology, and it's about man and nature, right, as separate units, as separate realities almost, even though we know all of us live in nature. So I think that's the first issue that I speak to, is this great divide between what we think of as a social problem and as social relations, and then what we think of as environmental problems and environmental relations.
I guess my challenge is, where does it start? I mean, do we go back before Genesis? Do we go back to the beginning of time? I mean, how far back do you go?
I think that's in a way, that's both the environmentalist position, that it has something to do with human nature, and the sort of pro-big business, pro-market, neoliberal position of, well, it's human nature to build world markets in the ways that we have seen them over the past 40 years or 400 years, for that matter. And that ignores some fundamental issues of how humans have built their societies and built their relationships with each other over a long time, and the kinds of impacts that it's had with the whole web of life, like all of nature, including humans in it. So we have 2 big ruptures over the past 12,000 years or so, and that sounds big, but it's actually very important to what's going on right now. The dawn of civilization about 12,000 years ago coincides with a massive climate shift from the Pleistocene, Ice Age, glacial period. If you think of the big, gigantic mammals that existed in North America and that in the form of giraffes still exist in Africa, those dominated. Those were quickly wiped out. There was a massive change in human life, which was based on the emergence of cities and settled agriculture. And that coincides with the dawn of what geologists call the Holocene. That is, this long era of climate stability. So we know that era is coming to an end right now. So there's something about civilization itself and its relationship to agriculture that's now very much in question, because the climate conditions that have been stable for 12,000 years are now destabilizing. Now, there's another issue that, yes, many civilizations, you can go to the Middle Ages in Europe, you can look at the Song dynasty in 10th century China, you can go many places around the world before about 500 years ago and see lots of environmental problems. But they didn't globalize those problems. That began with Columbus in 1492. And you see, for the first time, the Europeans, who were a very backward civilization, started to figure out something about how to conquer the world. And they said, oh, look, we can marry commerce with warfare. And we can create a model that can then go around the world and find all sorts of goodies that we can turn a profit on. And in fact, if you read Columbus's diaries of that first journey, he is completely obsessed with gold. And he is completely obsessed with anything he can find, plants, animals, anything else that might turn a profit.
So that's an interesting comparison, because I would have gone to the Industrial Revolution and you've gone to Columbus.
Well, the Industrial Revolution is this very old notion of the modern world, that it all comes from the steam engine. Now, we know a few things about this era that we didn't know 100 years ago. So, for one thing, fossil fuels were not invented. I mean, if you understand that there was always coal on the ground, at least for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years before it was widely used in England, but it only became a fossil fuel when particular relationships that privileged profit-seeking in the market came to dominate. So fossil fuels were really invented not in the 18th century, but in the 16th century, and you can see it with the English, with coal, and then with the Dutch in northwestern Europe around peat, a kind of proto-coal. It's the youngest of fossil fuels. So these forms of energy predate what we think of as the Industrial Revolution by centuries. But that's just one part of it. The other part of it is that in order for coal and the steam engine to do their work, changing the world. And there's no doubt that they did change the world. And then after that, we got the internal combustion engine, the jet engine, that have also had profound, extraordinary impacts. But if you look at the relations that made it possible, you start to see that, for instance, the dominance of steam engines in industry only occurs after about 1830. Well, what happened before then? Well, it turns out there was a revolution in growing and cultivating and processing cotton. And where was the cotton coming from? From the American South, worked by slave labor. So you have to begin to see that something like cotton fields and slave labor were just as fundamental to the Industrial Revolution as any of these other problems, as any of these other innovations. So you have to begin to look at, well, what are the relations that made the steam engine possible? And really the great way that the steam engine changed the world was not so much through the industrial factories, and we have these textbook images in our heads of Manchester textile factories with smoke belching into the air. But that was only a smaller part of the story. Really, the story was one of railroads and steamships carrying not just markets, but European power into the rest of the world and opening up the whole of the planet to be ransacked for what I call cheap nature, or cheap labor, cheap food, cheap raw materials, cheap energy. All of this was made possible through coal, but also through relations that said basically what was in Columbus's mind when he was writing his diaries on that first voyage, that said, we're going to look for free stuff that we can take and then turn a profit.
I asked the question only because it was in your book about Carl Schmitt, where you quoted, "Can we come to peace through war?" And I guess that's part of this discussion.
Well, absolutely not. We have to come to peace through justice. And if we're talking about capitalism, we have to understand something very important, that capitalism was only partly made by people that we would call businessmen. And I do mean mostly men, overwhelmingly mostly men. Capitalism was made by states going to war with each other. And to go to war with each other, yeah, you can pay a little bit through taxes, but mostly you have to borrow money. And we know in America, we know a lot about that because half of our taxes goes to the war machine in one form or another. And that's just a recent example of a very long history that goes back to the 16th and 17th centuries of governments borrow money and go to war. And so we have to be very aware of that history and of the kind of extraordinary violence and destruction that has been a part of this process of turning money or resources into this weird beast that we call capital. That is money that only exists to make more money. And wars has been fundamental to that.
So how do we change it? How do we find, I hear a lot of people talking about downward economics. We've been accused of always being a more society. How do we get away from wanting more? How do we learn to live differently?
Well, I think that there's this myth that individual consumption, having a particular kind of car or television or computer or house, is about the quality of life. And I don't think that's true. I think that the quality of life is, yes, about a certain ability to have a place to live and to buy groceries and to feed one's family and all that. But if we think about the most important things in life, most of those are collective or community processes, the raising of children and schools. Many of the things that would benefit the vast majority, even in the global north, even in relatively prosperous societies like the United States and Canada, many of the things that would benefit us could be realized with less individual consumption. So better public transportation that would be more sustainable, better schools, better access to sustainable food, to healthy food. Basically, we need to look at collective consumption that would benefit all of us instead of simply a market, individual-oriented worldview that says, well, if I have to drive a car that's worth $5,000, I'm living more poorly than somebody driving a $50,000 car. And so I think that's part of what has to go on, that this talk of, everyone's got to learn to live with less is maybe true in a very narrow sense, but I think fantastically false in a wider sense in terms of the quality of life. And we've learned in recent years that even rich people in grossly unequal societies have worse health and live shorter lives than the rich who live in very equal societies like Sweden or Norway.
What should our focus be on? I keep hearing it's climate change, that if we don't fix climate change, all of the other issues or ills of humanity won't matter because we won't be here.
I think there's a real danger, and there's no easy way to deal with this, but there's a real danger to saying climate first, and then everything else has to wait. We learned an important lesson over the past century around struggles for justice. And in the early 20th century, it was white male socialists who were saying, look, socialism for us first, and then women, and then the colonial world, they would get their justice later. And we learned that not only didn't work, but was counterproductive. So I think that we need to have a holistic approach to climate change that says climate is not separate from questions of racism and sexism and profound class inequality. And that indeed class, not just class inequality, but class power is at the center of climate inaction. It is the class power of the world's 1%, or even smaller number, those handful of billionaires who own more wealth than the bottom half of the population, who are enforcing climate inaction. So I think that does speak to a politics, and I think that's what you're getting at. We need to push for democratization. Now, in Canada, you have something that approximates a functioning democracy. In the United States has never been a democracy and is even less democratic today than it has been in recent decades. So there is a real crisis of democracy in the United States. So it seems to me that there's going to be no effective dealing with climate change unless we have a democratic ecology.
I guess there's a couple of questions in there, and I wrestle with comments from Roy Scranton and a school of authors who believe that we've passed our best before date, that it's hopeless and there's nothing we can do, so go party. And then there's Al Gore and others who think that it's incredibly serious and we need to get off the couch and get busy at fixing this. And then there's various scales that